This is Mr. Holsey with H Squared, Sufficiently Understood Science, and today we're going to be learning about survival of the fittest by natural selection. So I'd like to start this tutorial with a quick quote from Charles Darwin from his book The Origin of Species in 1859. This preservation of favorable individual differences and variations and the destruction of those that are injurious I have called natural selection. So when it comes to natural selection, we have some very key points in this quote. Preservation of favorable individual differences and the destruction of those that are injurious. And we're going to get into what this really means a little bit later. Now you've probably heard his natural selection called survival of the fittest. But in reality, the term survival of the fittest was never used by Darwin. Darwin Darwin observed that organisms have the potential for very high fertility, fertility being babies born, offspring born. So they have the ability to produce and often do produce large numbers of offspring. The population size, though, would quickly become unmanageable if all the offspring survived. The reason for that is that resources that organisms need to survive, such as food, water, shelter, nesting sites, mates, are limited. There's a limited number of these resources, and there's not enough resources for all the individuals for everyone to survive, and therefore there will be competition for those resources, and those most adapted for gathering those resources will survive. And that brings us into a very interesting part of survival of the fittest or natural selection, and that is something we call carrying capacity. This is the amount of organisms an environment can sustain. And so I'm going to make a very simple graph here to kind of show you what I mean. Okay? And so initially, populations of organisms grow rapidly. I'm going to change that color actually to red. Grow very rapidly. This is what we call a J-curve. Okay, and it's showing accelerated growth. But eventually, the number of organisms that an environment can sustain they start to reach the number of those organisms, and the curve begins to even out. And so this is the part where we call it the S-curve. And so where this evens out, I'm going to change colors really quick, about right here, shows us the carrying capacity of this specific environment. The number of organisms that can survive on the available resources hits about right here. And you can see it has natural little ups and downs, ups and downs. And so organisms need those resources, and without them, there's only going to be so many that can survive. Those that survive are going to be the ones with the best adaptations, typically. The second principle of natural selection is variation. Simply put, differences among individuals in the population. So individuals in populations are not identical. Then we're specifically talking about sexually reproducing organisms, but also asexual reproducing organisms can have variation from time to time. So an adaptation is an inherited trait that increases an organism's chances of survival. And once again, remember, to have an inherited trait, that means it's passed on through DNA. Okay? So variations occur because of changes in that DNA, mutations. And so meiosis, during the crossing over during prophase 1, we see these mutations or changes or passing on of these genes. They can also happen through random mate selection and fertilization. And we see a really good example right over here with these ladybugs. Not all the ladybugs are the same. And so we have different colors, we have different numbers of spots. We have one right here that has almost white head, whereas this one has a black head, things like that. And so there's going to be natural variation. And it's through the creation of gametes, those sex cells, egg and sperm, from meiosis, that we get these variations. Meiosis guarantees variation in an organism. Now, how are variations helpful? Because the environment changes. Things aren't always going to be the same. Environments change, and it doesn't have to be like big catastrophic changes. It can be very subtle changes that change the balance of what variations are better for an environment. So the more variation within the species, the more likely it will survive. Kind of put it this way. If everyone was the same, they're going to all be vulnerable to the same environmental changes or diseases. We have people that have natural immunities to certain viruses, or can handle it better, or can handle colder weather better. And so having lots of variation in the species ensures that life continues in some way or fashion, because they're adapted to actually surviving conditions very similar. So the more variation of types of species in a habitat, the more likely at least some will survive. For example, when the big meteorite asteroid hit the Earth and changed conditions enough to drive the dinosaurs into extinction, they were replaced by mammals who were living closer to the ground, were much smaller, didn't need as much energy and food to survive as the large dinosaurs. And so these smaller creatures were more adapted to surviving these harsh conditions than the larger dinosaurs, and therefore survived. And so mammals replaced dinosaurs as the dominant form of life on the planet. So looking at this, we can look at community A and community B. Keeping this in mind, variation is good. Let's say that in both of these communities, like alternate timelines, community A has a lot of biodiversity, whereas community B doesn't. And there is a wildfire. Okay? Now, because of this wildfire, much of the biodiversity is wiped out. So, community A will have a better chance of surviving a natural disaster because there's lots of biodiversity. There's lots of different forms of animals. There's lots of plants and trees and animals. But here in community B, we only have a small amount. So it's more likely that that population could be completely wiped out than in community A. So a question to think about is, which would have the better chance of survival? Thinking about variations because of meiosis and things like that. Asexually reproducing organisms, sexually reproducing organisms, or both having an equal chance. Now, let's think about that for a second. In asexually reproducing organisms, the offspring are pretty much the same. Very few variations between the two. In sexually reproducing organisms, because of meiosis, we have offspring that are different. So, and the third option, both having an equal chance, I can go and tell you they do not have an equal chance. Asexually reproducing organisms have a harder time with adaptations. They have a much harder time. And so asexually reproducing organisms will not adapt as quickly. It takes a very long time for asexually reproducing populations to adapt, whereas sexually reproducing organisms, because they have variation basically built into their DNA, they are going to have an easier time surviving natural disasters, because more than likely there's enough of a population that has a variation that is more likely to survive. So let's talk about the third principle of natural selection, inheritance. Some of this variation is hereditable. And if we don't remember, hereditable means it can be passed on through DNA. Okay? And so we can pass this on through genetic information. So some of the variation between individuals in the population has to be hereditable. It has to be able to be passed on from one generation to the next. In other words, reproduction. And 4, selection. Those with favorable traits survive to reproduce. And like I said earlier in the video, it doesn't matter if I'm the most adapted thing in the on the planet, I have to be able to pass on these traits. So some of the traits found in populations enhance the survival and reproduction of the organisms possessing them. Okay? They have to be selected for reproduction by a mate. Reproduction has to happen. So the favored traits will spread through the population, and over many generations, the species will become more adapted, will become adapted to its environment. And over time, these changes can lead to the formation of entirely new species. They become so genetically different from what they started off as that they are now considered entirely new species of organisms. So the result of natural selection is organisms less suited to their environment die or contribute fewer offspring. Better suited individuals are more likely to survive and reproduce. And that's the key word: survive and reproduce. Now, environmental factors that lead to selection can be biotic, such as living things like a lion eating an animal. That animal right here is now out of the gene pool. It can it's no longer surviving, therefore it can no longer reproduce. Or it could be abiotic, non-living things, such as the weather, that causes something to be pulled out of the genetic pool, and therefore could no longer be selected for reproduction. Now, a key concept to remember is fitness, the relative genetic contribution of an organism to future generations, determined by survival and reproduction. See, we finally got back to survival of the fittest, that being able to pass on that genetic information. So a gazelle that does not survive cannot contribute to future generations. But survival alone does not assure a genetic contribution. The gazelle has to reproduce. Survive, reproduce. You have to do both. Now, natural selection is not a guarantee. There is no guarantee that that adaptation is going to make it forever. It's more of a statistical phenomenon. More likely than not, better adapted organisms survive, but it's not always the case. Natural selection acts on the phenotype. And remember, the phenotype, outward appearance, what you show. Okay, what shows in your genetics. So you have your genotype, which is all your genetics. Your phenotype is your physical appearances, how your body works based on those genetics. So these are going to be what's actually showing. I'm going to put outward appearance and how it works. And ultimately, this will act on the genotype. If you think about natural selection with genotypes, the phenotype is going to be either a dominant trait or a recessive trait. Let's say the recessive trait is the better adapted version of the trait. And so eventually that being passed down, because it's all that's there, will remove other traits from the gene pool, acting upon the genotype. And so genotype is all traits that you have, not necessarily the ones that are expressed. So I'm going to kind of clarify that. So we're going to put expressed, above the phenotype area. Those are the ones that you show. So we're going to talk about one last example really quick, and then we'll do a little summary. So the peppered moth is one of the best examples of natural selection. So in the 1800s, the Industrial Revolution began in Europe. And so there were these peppered moths. Well, there's a lot of soot in the air from the factories. And you can easily see this black moth right there. Very easy to see. But you might not notice the white moth that's also pictured. Now, the black moth was not as adapted to the natural environment with all the moss and things like that. And so they were more commonly eaten by predators. But because of the Industrial Revolution, the moss on the trees died off. Okay? And so the moths basically switched roles. Now the black moth becomes the more adapted to the current environment, whereas the white moth is now being picked off by birds and predators. And so environmental changes can change what is needed at that time. And the natural variation in these organisms, and in this particular species, allow it to survive. So to summarize, looking back our 4 principles of natural selection, we can break these down into 2 main categories. And go figure, I've been saying these words over and over and over. The first 2 are all about survival, while the second 2 are all about reproduction. You cannot have natural selection without these 2 things. You have to have survival, you have to have reproduction. And I hope you've enjoyed learning about survival of the fittest by natural selection. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe so you know whenever we post new tutorials. And looking forward to seeing you for our next video here on H Squared Sufficiently Understood Science.